The day they replaced me with his daughter, I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I just sat there in that glass-walled office, staring at the man I had worked beside for 23 years, as he struggled to dress betrayal in polite words. "You've been incredible, Mark," he said, his voice rehearsed, almost trembling. "But it's time to pass the torch to someone who understands the future." His daughter, Emily, sat beside him, too young to understand the weight of what was being done. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from being handed power without earning it. I had mentored her once. She used to ask me about patents, about designs, about how to protect innovation. Now she was taking my job, my team, my life's work, with a look that said she thought she deserved it. I left quietly. 23 years of loyalty packed into a cardboard box, while security guards stood by the elevator like I was a stranger. On my desk, I left my access card, my badge, and something they didn't notice, my silence. Because when I walked out of that building, I didn't just leave behind an office. I took something far more valuable with me: control. You see, I wasn't just an engineer. I was the architect of every major patent that company owned. From the solar compression grids to the adaptive cooling systems, the ones that had brought in billions in revenue, I was the name behind the curtain. Over the years, they'd let me handle the filings myself, trusted me to manage the legal documentation. And they never noticed that the ownership structure wasn't quite what they thought. Each patent was filed under a subsidiary holding group, a group I controlled. My little insurance policy against corporate amnesia. For weeks after my dismissal, I heard nothing. No calls, no apologies. The press celebrated the new generation of leadership. Emily gave interviews about innovation and forward-thinking energy solutions. My face, once part of the company's identity, was scrubbed from every article. That was fine. They thought I was gone. They thought I was finished. But the thing about people who build systems is, they always leave themselves a back door. One morning, 2 months after I was let go, I filed a set of notices through my attorney. One for each patent. The filings stated, in clear, unemotional legal language, that I was revoking their usage rights. Effective immediately, the company no longer held the legal authority to manufacture, distribute, or profit from the 28 core patents that powered their entire product line. In essence, I had just unplugged their billion-dollar empire. The first call came from an unknown number. It was the CEO himself, his voice no longer polished, no longer calm. "Mark, what the hell are you doing?" he shouted. I listened quietly, then said, "I'm just protecting my intellectual property." There was silence on the line, followed by disbelief. "You wouldn't dare," he said finally. "You signed those over." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Read the filings carefully," I replied. The rights were licensed, not transferred. And that license ended when my employment did. Then I hung up. Within a week, their stock dropped 20%. Production halted. Suppliers demanded answers. Investors began to panic. Emily, the visionary successor, gave a trembling press statement insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But the truth was, they were finished. Every machine they owned, every blueprint they sold, every product they shipped, it all depended on technology they no longer had the legal right to use. Lawyers called me, begged me, threatened me. One even tried to offer me a settlement to reconsider. But I wasn't interested in their money. This wasn't about wealth. It was about respect. About every late night I spent fixing problems that weren't mine, every idea they took credit for, every meeting where I was told to let the younger team handle it. This was balance. Then one morning, I saw it on the news. The company had declared bankruptcy. The CEO had stepped down. His daughter had gone silent. The empire I built for them had finally turned to ash. I didn't celebrate. I just poured myself a cup of coffee and went back to my workshop, a quiet place filled with blueprints, sketches, and new ideas. Because destruction was never my goal. Creation always was. Weeks later, I licensed those same patents, this time to a smaller, ethical firm that valued innovation over ego. The deal was fair, the team young but hungry. They asked me why I didn't sell to the highest bidder. I told them, because not everything worth building is for sale. Sometimes, revenge doesn't roar. It doesn't make headlines or leave ruins behind. Sometimes, it's quiet, a simple correction to the imbalance of arrogance. They thought I was obsolete. But the truth is, they were the ones who couldn't see past their reflection. And as I watched the sunrise spill across my workbench, I realized something. I hadn't destroyed them. I'd just reminded them who built them in the first place. A few months passed, and the world seemed to forget the chaos. The media stopped talking about the company's collapse, the CEO disappeared into retirement, and his daughter vanished from the public eye. But I knew they hadn't forgotten me. You don't forget the man who dismantled your empire with a stack of legal documents and a steady hand. I started getting emails from old colleagues. Some were angry, blaming me for the jobs lost. Others quietly thanked me for doing what they never had the courage to. You showed them that experience isn't expendable, one message read. Another said, we thought you were gone for good, but you made history. I didn't reply to most of them. I wasn't interested in being anyone's hero or villain. I just wanted to live on my terms again. The new company I partnered with was smaller, leaner, but alive with something the old one had lost years ago, passion. Their engineers reminded me of myself when I first started, wide-eyed and restless, driven by curiosity rather than profit margins. Working with them reignited something I thought I'd lost. They listened. They respected the craft. And when they asked me for advice, I didn't give them corporate slogans. I told them the truth. Protect what you build. Don't ever let someone in a suit own your ideas just because they sign your paycheck. A year later, one of those young engineers brought me a prototype based on one of my old designs, a clean, efficient turbine that could change the entire energy sector. It was better than my original model, refined, elegant. We couldn't have done this without your patents, she said, smiling. I looked at the spinning core, humming softly under the lab lights, and for the first time in a long while, I felt pride without bitterness. No, I told her. You couldn't have done it without your courage. Meanwhile, the remnants of my old company were being picked apart by competitors. Their assets sold in auctions, their trademarks dissolved, their brand reduced to a cautionary tale in business schools. The CEO's daughter resurfaced briefly, some magazine tried to spin her downfall as a learning experience. But behind the polished interviews, I saw the truth in her eyes. She finally understood what I'd been trying to teach her years ago. That legacy isn't inherited. It's earned. One afternoon, I received a letter. No return address, just my name typed cleanly on the envelope. Inside was a single page, handwritten. Mark, it said, I should have listened. I thought I could run what I didn't understand. You were right about everything. I hope you can forgive me. Emily. I sat there, staring at her handwriting for a long time. I didn't feel anger anymore. Just a quiet sadness for how easily people destroy what they don't appreciate. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Not all apologies come when you expect them, and not all revenge needs to end with victory. Sometimes, peace is the greater punishment. Now, in my late 50s, I work from a modest studio overlooking the city. No titles, no deadlines, no board meetings, just me, my designs, and a team that believes in something real. The patents I revoked are now part of a new portfolio, one that powers clean energy projects around the world. They once called me a relic of the past, a man too old to understand the future. But the future, as it turns out, was always in my hands. When I walk through the workshop and see the machines running, hear the laughter of young engineers, and feel that same hum of creation that started my journey 23 years ago, I can't help but smile. Because in the end, revenge wasn't taking them down. It was standing back up and building something better without them. Some evenings, when the lab goes quiet and the city outside hums in low, electric tones, I find myself alone by the drafting table, the same one I've used since my first day at the company, the edges worn smooth from years of work. I keep it not as nostalgia, but as a reminder. Every line, every smudge, every faded sketch on that wood carries a history they can't erase. They took my title, my office, my salary, but not the essence of what I am. You can't fire a mind that never stopped building. It's funny, when you spend over 2 decades somewhere, it becomes a part of your DNA. The routines, the morning greetings, the sound of the factory floor, it all stays with you, like an old scar. But over time, I realized that what I missed wasn't the company. It was the purpose. The act of creation itself. The quiet satisfaction of solving a problem no one else could. That feeling, they could never take away. The world moved on, as it always does. News cycles found new scandals, new executives fell from grace, and my story became just another legend whispered in corporate corridors. Some called it the patent purge. Others called it poetic justice. But for me, it wasn't about destruction. It was about cleansing. About taking back something sacred that had been turned into currency by people who couldn't even spell integrity. One morning, I received an invitation from a university I hadn't heard from in years. They wanted me to give a guest lecture to engineering students about intellectual property and innovation ethics. I almost declined. I didn't want to relive the past, but something about the message struck me. These students are the ones who'll build what comes next, the dean had written. They should hear from someone who learned the hard way what it costs to build without protection. When I stood in front of that lecture hall, rows of young faces watching, I realized why I was really there. I wasn't just teaching them about patents or design law, I was teaching them how to fight for themselves. I told them the truth, the one no one ever told me. The world will try to buy your ideas, then buy your silence. Don't sell either. The room went still. No applause, no noise, just understanding. I saw it in their eyes, that spark of awareness that comes before a revolution. After the lecture, a student approached me, a young woman with a notebook full of equations and oil smudges on her hands. "Mr. Hall," she said, "they told us you destroyed your company. But from what I see, you saved your work." I smiled. "Sometimes," I said, "the only way to save what you love is to burn down the walls that keep it trapped." That night, as I drove home through the quiet streets, I caught my reflection in the window. Older now, yes, but sharper, calmer, freer. The kind of man who no longer needed a title to define his worth. I thought about the CEO and his daughter, wherever they were, whatever they were doing, and I didn't feel anger anymore. Only clarity. They'd built a kingdom out of arrogance. I built something that would last. Now, every day when I unlock my studio, sunlight pours through the glass and spills across rows of new blueprints. Some are mine, some are my team's, but all of them are ours. That's the difference. We build together. We build for tomorrow. And sometimes, as I sip my coffee and listen to the low hum of machines spinning up, I think about that last conversation in his office, the one that started it all. "It's time to pass the torch," he'd said. Turns out, he was right. He just never imagined the torch would light a fire he couldn't control. That's the real ending to this story. Not revenge. Not ruin. renewal. Because while they were busy replacing me, I was busy replacing them with something honest, enduring, and alive. And as the future unfolds, powered by the very ideas they once took for granted, I'll be watching quietly, knowing the truth. They built a company. But I built a legacy. A few years later, that legacy began to ripple further than I could have imagined. The small firm I'd licensed my patents to had grown rapidly, faster than any of us predicted. What began as a handful of engineers working in a rented warehouse was now a thriving operation with international contracts, awards, and a waiting list of young talent who wanted to be part of something real. The industry started calling them the Quiet Revolutionaries, a group that proved innovation didn't need billion-dollar boardrooms or nepotism, it just needed people who believed in what they were building. Sometimes, investors would visit our facility, their suits too crisp for the grease and hum of the machines. They'd look around, expecting chaos, but instead found order, laughter, and purpose. "You run this like an artist's workshop," one of them said to me once. I just smiled. That's because invention is an art. Business only survives when it remembers that. The irony wasn't lost on me. Years ago, I was told I didn't understand the business side. But now, the same ideas that got me fired were making millions for people who valued integrity over ego. One afternoon, I was invited to a renewable energy summit in Copenhagen. It was one of those high-profile events, polished, global, full of executives pretending they still cared about ideals. I almost declined again, but curiosity got the better of me. When I arrived, I scanned the room and froze. Across the hall, giving a keynote speech on ethical innovation, was Emily, the CEO's daughter. Time had changed her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something softer, almost weary. When our eyes met, she stopped mid-sentence. For a moment, the noise around us faded. She finished her talk, then came straight toward me. "I didn't think you'd come," she said quietly. I shrugged. "Didn't think I'd be invited." She smiled faintly, then looked down. "You know, I read every one of your patents after it all collapsed. I understand now what you were trying to protect. I was too young to see it then." I studied her face for a long moment. She was no longer the smug heiress who once took my seat at the table. She was human again. "The truth," I said finally, "has a way of catching up with all of us." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I'm rebuilding now," she said softly. "Not what my father made. Something better. Maybe this time, something honest." We shook hands, not as enemies, not even as equals, but as people who'd both been broken by the same system and learned from it. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was recognition. Sometimes, that's enough. When I flew home that night, I looked out the airplane window at the lights scattered below like constellations. I thought about how far things had come, from a man walking out of a building with a box of his belongings to one whose ideas were now powering cities, creating jobs, inspiring students. Not because of revenge, but because of reclamation. Because I'd refused to let someone else define my ending. Now, in the quiet of my home, surrounded by models and sketches, I sometimes think about legacy, not the kind you can measure in dollars, but the kind you leave in people. The students I've mentored, the companies I've helped build, the engineers who tell me they started designing because they read my story online, that's what lasts. So yes, the CEO replaced me with his daughter. He took my title, my office, my pride. But I took back everything that mattered. The patents, the integrity, the future. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden in all of it. Power fades, but creation endures. You can erase a name from a company directory, but you can't erase the hands that built it. And when the next generation stands where I once stood, between ambition and integrity, I hope they remember this story. That once, a man was told he was too old, too slow, too done. And instead of fading quietly, he reminded the world that the people who build are always stronger than the people who take. Years later, when I was well into my 60s, I received a letter in the mail from a law firm I didn't recognize. It was printed on expensive paper, embossed with a gold seal. Inside was a note, brief, formal, but heavy with meaning. The CEO, my former boss, had passed away. His estate was tangled in debts and lawsuits, the company he once ruled now a hollow shell, its name reduced to whispers of what could have been. Attached to the letter was a request from Emily, now the head of a modest but respectable tech incubator. She wanted to meet, one last time, to discuss a partnership. Curiosity tugged at me again, the same curiosity that had carried me through every design and blueprint I'd ever touched. When I walked into her new office, smaller, humbler, with walls covered in sketches and prototypes, I saw something that took me by surprise. On the center shelf sat one of my old models, a solar housing design I'd made 20 years ago, cleaned and framed under glass. "You kept that," I said quietly. She smiled. It reminded me of what vision looks like when it isn't clouded by greed. We talked for hours, not about revenge, not even about business, but about purpose. About how corporations rise and fall, how the people who chase power end up hollow, and how those who build out of belief create legacies that outlive them. She told me her new incubator was helping young inventors from low-income backgrounds, people who would have never been given a chance in her father's world. "I guess this is my way of fixing things," she said softly. "Maybe it's yours too." That day, I agreed to join her as an advisor, not for money, not for prestige, but for closure. To guide the next generation so they'd never have to fight the same battles I did. And maybe, in that small act, something healed between us. Not forgiveness, not friendship, but understanding. In the end, revenge had burned away long ago. What was left was justice, quiet and unassuming. The company that betrayed me was gone, forgotten by time. But my work, our work, still stood. The patents I had reclaimed were now public, free for educational use. Students in universities across the world studied them, improved them, built upon them. And every time I saw one of their projects succeed, I felt that old spark, the one that used to burn late at night when I believed innovation could still be pure. Sometimes I think about the moment they fired me, how humiliating it felt, how small they tried to make me. But now, years later, I see it for what it truly was, liberation. The day I lost their approval was the day I found my freedom. And maybe that's what real revenge is, not destruction, not humiliation, but transcendence. To rise so far above what they thought you were capable of that they become irrelevant. Now, as I walk through my workshop, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, I see the same tools I used decades ago. They're old, worn, but still work perfectly. Much like me. I pick one up, trace the edge of a half-finished prototype, and smile. Because somewhere, out there, another young engineer is dreaming, sketching, building, and maybe one day, they'll face their own CEO. Maybe they'll be told they're not good enough, not young enough, not the right fit. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remember the story of the man who refused to let arrogance erase his purpose. In the end, it wasn't about the money, or the patents, or even the revenge. It was about proving one simple truth: you can't fire vision. You can't replace passion. And you can't silence someone whose life's work was built not for profit, but for progress. The CEO's legacy was buried with his empire. Mine lives on, in every idea, every spark, and every mind that dares to build again. Years drifted by, and time softened the edges of everything: anger, pride, even victory. I spent my mornings walking to the same small cafe where I used to draft blueprints on napkins, back when dreams seemed fragile but endless. The barista, a young woman in her 20s, once recognized my name from a lecture she'd watched online. "You're the one who took back the patents, right?" she said, half in awe, half in curiosity. I smiled, stirring my coffee. "I'm the one who remembered what was his," I replied. She laughed, not fully understanding, but I could see the spark in her eyes, the same hunger I once had. It was strange, seeing my name slowly shift from controversy to inspiration. The story that began as an act of defiance had become a case study in business schools, lectures on intellectual property ethics, innovation independence, and corporate arrogance. I was invited to speak occasionally, and though I never liked crowds, I went. I'd stand before rooms of sharp young minds and tell them the same thing every time: don't ever let someone own your brilliance just because they sign your paycheck. One evening, after a guest talk at a university, a man approached me, mid-40s, expensive suit, confident stride. "You probably don't remember me," he said, extending a hand. "I was one of the interns at the firm the year they fired you. You told me once that the secret to design wasn't perfection, it was persistence." I blinked, surprised. He smiled. "That stuck with me. I run my own firm now. We do things differently. We build people before we build products." I shook his hand and realized something quietly profound. Even in the ruins of betrayal, I had planted seeds. And those seeds had grown into forests I'd never even see. That night, I sat in my study surrounded by sketches and old papers. My walls were lined with framed patent certificates, not as trophies, but as reminders of what perseverance can reclaim. I thought about the CEO, his daughter, the empire that crumbled, and how all of it had once seemed like the end of the world. But it wasn't the end, it was a shedding. I had been forced to lose everything false so I could rebuild something true. Revenge had long ago turned into redemption. There was no satisfaction in their downfall anymore, only peace in knowing I'd built something that couldn't be taken. My revenge was never about their suffering, it was about my survival, my reclamation of worth. And as I watched the next generation of thinkers and creators rise, I knew they would carry that same fire forward. Sometimes I still visit the old corporate tower, the one that used to bear the company's name in giant letters. It's abandoned now, windows shattered, the logo rusted and faded. I stand at the gate for a few moments, listening to the silence, remembering the echo of footsteps in marble halls where decisions were made without conscience. I don't feel bitterness anymore, just a strange gratitude. Because without that fall, I'd never have discovered what freedom truly feels like. Before leaving, I take a small notepad from my pocket and scribble a single line, one I've said to myself for years, and slip it through the cracks of the locked door: "You fired an employee, but you awakened an inventor." Then I turn and walk away into the evening light, knowing that some stories don't end with vengeance or applause. Some end with peace. The peace of a man who was once dismissed as outdated but ended up outlasting everything that tried to erase him. As the years moved further along, the noise of the past quieted until it became nothing more than a distant hum, a story I carried, not a scar I wore. I had become something unexpected, a mentor, a living relic of a time when creation meant sacrifice and loyalty had teeth. Young innovators from all corners of the world began reaching out to me. They'd send their prototypes, their sketches, their hopeful questions, asking how to protect what they built without letting greed poison it. And in their letters, I could see reflections of who I once was: naive, determined, burning with that dangerous mix of belief and ambition. One evening, I received a message from a young man named Rafi. He was barely 25, an engineer from a small firm in Singapore. He wrote, "They're trying to take my idea, sir. The one I built from scratch. I can't afford lawyers. What should I do?" His words carried panic, the same kind I once felt when the ground beneath me gave way. I took a long breath, smiled faintly, and replied, "You fight. But not with anger, with knowledge. Make it so that your creation can't survive without you." That's the only revenge that truly lasts. Weeks later, he sent a follow-up message, a picture of his team holding a new prototype, with a simple caption, "We did it." And in that moment, I realized something. My revenge had long since evolved into legacy. Every inventor I guided, every idea I helped protect, every young creator who refused to be silenced, they were my quiet retribution against every arrogant executive who thought people were replaceable. Not long after, a journalist came to interview me for a feature titled "The Man Who Outlasted His Empire." He asked me, "Do you ever wish it had gone differently? That they'd never fired you?" I leaned back in my chair, smiled, and said, "If they hadn't, I would have stayed loyal to a dream that wasn't mine." Sometimes, destruction is just disguised liberation. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded, as if something clicked. The article went viral. People called me the quiet rebel of industry, which made me laugh. I wasn't a rebel. I was simply a man who remembered his worth when others tried to erase it. My story wasn't about payback, it was about patience. The kind of slow, steady justice that doesn't come from lawsuits or headlines, but from time revealing the truth. On my 70th birthday, I stood in the same workshop I'd built from nothing, surrounded by my former students, now engineers, CEOs, inventors themselves. They handed me a framed plaque. It wasn't made of gold or silver. Just steel, engraved with one line, "You taught us to build things that last, and to never let anyone own what we create." For the first time in decades, I felt tears burn behind my eyes. Not from sorrow or anger, but from something deeper, the realization that I had already won long ago. Not the loud victory of vengeance, but the quiet triumph of endurance. The CEO who fired me was gone. His company, his wealth, his ego, all forgotten. But my name, my ideas, my influence, they lived on in the hands of those who came after me. As the celebration faded into laughter and stories, I found myself staring at an old photo framed on my desk, me, standing outside that corporate tower on the day I was fired, clutching a box of my things. I remembered the sting, the humiliation, the disbelief. And then I looked around at everything I had now, the students, the inventions, the peace. I smiled. "Thank you," I whispered to that broken version of myself. "If you hadn't fallen that day, none of this would have existed." And with that, I turned off the lights in my workshop, the hum of the machines slowly dying down, and stepped outside. The night air was cool, calm, full of distant city lights. I looked up at the stars and thought, not with anger or pride, but with a quiet certainty, sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's building something so timeless that even your enemies end up standing in its light. And so, after all the years, all the noise, all the battles fought in silence and dignity, I finally understood what every fall, every betrayal, every sleepless night had been leading toward. The day they fired me, they thought they'd ended a career. But what they really did was set something unstoppable in motion. They freed the part of me that didn't need titles, boardrooms, or permission to create. They gave me back the one thing they never understood, ownership of my own purpose. I look back now not with anger, but with gratitude. Because without their arrogance, I'd never have discovered what real strength looks like. It isn't loud. It doesn't shout in victory or gloat over failure. Real strength builds quietly, brick by brick, idea by idea, until one day it stands so tall that no empire of greed can cast a shadow over it. In the end, their empire vanished. Their names faded from the industry, their legacy eaten away by the very greed that once made them powerful. But my work, our work, endures. It lives in blueprints, in classrooms, in startups around the world. It lives every time someone refuses to let a paycheck define their value, every time an inventor protects their dream instead of selling it for comfort. So if there's a lesson buried beneath this story, it's this: revenge isn't always about tearing down what hurt you. Sometimes, it's about rising so far beyond it that the pain becomes irrelevant. Sometimes, the most powerful vengeance is to simply outlast, to keep creating, to keep believing, to keep existing when they expected you to disappear. Because one day, when the noise dies and the dust settles, they'll realize the truth I learned long ago. You can fire a person, but you can't erase what they've built. You can steal a title, but not a purpose. And you can try to silence someone, but you can't bury an idea that refuses to die.